Would you risk everything for a title, a throne, or even a promise you believed was owed to you? Would you challenge centuries of tradition, the whispers of a palace, and a king himself just to reclaim what you thought was yours? This is the question that now hangs over the British monarchy, the world watching in disbelief, as one of the most dramatic royal confrontations in recent history unfolds. King Charles III, faced with unprecedented demands from Meghan Markle, has made a decision that could alter the course of the monarchy forever. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, we have to unravel the layers of tension, negotiation, and raw emotion that have brought the palace to its knees. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It began quietly, as all such crises do. Meghan Markle, living across the Atlantic, far from the gilded corridors of Buckingham Palace, had sent a series of requests that shocked everyone who received them. Courtiers, advisors, and even members of the royal family struggled to believe the audacity of what was being demanded. Meghan did not ask politely. She did not hint. She made clear, uncompromising demands. She sought the restoration of royal privileges, a substantial financial settlement, and the reinstatement of her titles should she return to the United Kingdom. To many, these requests were staggering, not just in scale, but in implication. They were a direct challenge to the authority of the king himself. The story might seem simple on the surface, an estranged royal demanding what she believes is owed, but the reality is far more tangled. The British monarchy is not a business in the traditional sense, yet it operates with rules, traditions, and unspoken boundaries. Every title, every privilege, carries centuries of weight. Every action taken by a royal is scrutinized by the public, the press, and the world at large. For Meghan to demand this while living in California, with her own platform, her own media influence, was a bold, almost audacious maneuver. And for King Charles, it presented a dilemma unlike any he had faced before. Imagine, for a moment, the situation in the king's private chambers. Advisors pacing the floor, heads bowed, hands wringing, murmuring over the implications. Every lawyer, every press secretary, every aide understood the stakes. One misstep could inflame the media, alienate the public, and destabilize the monarchy in ways that would reverberate for generations. And yet, behind the calm exterior of Charles, a storm was brewing. For decades, he had watched the monarchy evolve, survive scandals, endure losses, and adapt to the public eye. He had learned, often painfully, the balance between compassion and duty. Now, that balance was being tested as never before. But why would Meghan make such demands? To understand, one must consider her journey from Hollywood royalty to actual royalty, and then to the public scrutiny that followed her every move. Meghan Markle, once celebrated as a modern, relatable figure within the monarchy, quickly became a lightning rod for controversy. Every appearance, every interview, every social media post was dissected. Fans and critics alike scrutinized her actions, intentions, and motives. And now, with her children, Archie and Lilibet, at the center of her personal and public narrative, Meghan's position had become even more complicated. Her demands were not merely personal. They were deeply strategic, aimed at securing her place within a system that had increasingly distanced itself from her. The king, meanwhile, was caught in a web of duty, public expectation, and personal resolve. Charles had always been measured, cautious, and thoughtful in his decisions. Yet in this moment, he faced a choice with no easy answers. Acquiesce to Meghan's demands and risk the integrity of the monarchy? Or take decisive action and confront what many believed could be a family fracture with global consequences? The tension was palpable. Advisors whispered about precedent, history, and protocol. Courtiers feared backlash. And behind it all, the public was waiting, hungry for every leak, every hint, every sign of what would come next. Adding to the complexity were the children. Archie and Lilibet, young and largely shielded from public scrutiny, were now indirectly involved in this drama. Meghan's demands implicitly linked her children's royal status to her own negotiations. For King Charles, this was unacceptable. Titles were not simply privileges to be bargained over. They were symbols of lineage, heritage, and responsibility. And yet, Every decision now would ripple through the lives of these children, whether they were ready for it or not. Across the ocean, Meghan's camp was preparing its strategy. Lawyers drafted statements, media consultants choreographed appearances, and allies began to leak hints of dissatisfaction to the press. It was a high-stakes game, played on multiple fronts: legal, personal, and public. Meghan knew the leverage she possessed, her global influence, her network of journalists, and her own undeniable charisma. She understood that any misstep by the palace could be turned into a narrative of injustice, one that could rally the public to her cause. And in some ways, it seemed that she had calculated every possible outcome. But what she may have underestimated was the resolve of a king who had seen challenges like this before and learned from them. Back in London, the palace moved swiftly. Emergency meetings were convened. Legal teams drafted contingency plans. Advisors analyzed every possible scenario, every potential headline, and every likely public reaction. The decision-making process was intense, private, and unprecedented. Courtiers spoke of tension in the hallways, of whispered conversations that stretched into the night. Some feared that the situation could spiral out of control, that media narratives might force the monarchy into a corner it could not escape. Others argued that a firm, decisive action was necessary to protect the institution from further disruption. The weight of history pressed down on every choice. And then, the turning point came. King Charles, after careful deliberation and consultation with his most trusted advisors, made the decision that would shock the world. It was not a decision made lightly, nor without consideration of the personal and public consequences. But in the king's mind, it was necessary. He signed an emergency order, a decree that would strip Meghan Markle of all her royal titles and privileges. It was a historic, unprecedented move, one that signaled the end of negotiations, the closure of doors, and a clear message. The monarchy would not be swayed by demands, no matter how high profile. This was a moment that would resonate through history, a turning point that would be dissected, analyzed, and debated for years to come. The news did not remain secret for long. Within hours, headlines around the world screamed of the dramatic confrontation between Meghan Markle and the king. Social media erupted. Memes circulated. Commentators offered instant analysis, speculating on every motive and consequence. Public opinion was divided, yet all agreed on one thing. This was extraordinary. The image of Meghan, defiant yet increasingly isolated, and King Charles, resolute and commanding, became a symbol of a monarchy under strain, caught between tradition and modernity, personal emotion and institutional duty. But the story did not end there. Meghan's response, anticipated by some and feared by others, would set the stage for an entirely new chapter of royal intrigue. Every move she made, every public statement, every private conversation could either escalate or resolve the crisis. And with the children at the center of the narrative, every decision carried even more weight. For King Charles, the emergency order was not just a legal or ceremonial action. It was a declaration of authority, a safeguard for the monarchy, and a message that tradition and protocol still held power, even in the face of public scrutiny and personal challenge. Now, as the world watches, the drama unfolds like never before. What began as demands from one woman has escalated into a historic confrontation, one that will shape the monarchy, the media, and public perception for years. The stakes have never been higher, the emotions never more raw, and the outcomes never more uncertain. And just when you think you understand the story, just when you believe the lines have been drawn, the next revelation threatens to overturn everything once again. What Meghan will do next, how the king will respond, and how the public will react remain unknown. And that is precisely what keeps everyone glued to the unfolding saga. She didn't ask. She demanded. And when the news reached Buckingham Palace, jaws dropped, hearts raced, and advisors whispered about consequences no one wanted to imagine. That's how one senior courtier described the moment Meghan Markle's latest demands landed on King Charles's desk. But to truly grasp the magnitude of what was happening, we need to step back and understand exactly what she was asking for, and why it sent shockwaves through one of the most disciplined and tradition-bound institutions in the world. It started as a private communication, carefully worded but impossible to ignore. Meghan, who had been living in California with Archie and Lilibet, made clear that she intended to return to the United Kingdom, but not on anyone else's terms. She outlined a list of demands so audacious that even seasoned royal advisors struggled to believe it. First, she wanted the reinstatement of her royal titles. To many, this seemed reasonable at first glance, but context matters. These were not merely ceremonial honors. They represented centuries of lineage, privilege, and protocol. To restore them would signal that tradition could be bent at will, a precedent the monarchy had never allowed. But the titles were only the beginning. Meghan also demanded financial support, thousands of dollars, far beyond what the royal family typically granted in cases of estrangement. This was not simply about living expenses. This was about recognition, validation, and control. Her request explicitly tied her financial support to the reinstatement of her status, essentially framing it as a transactional requirement for her return. The palace had never faced a situation quite like this, a royal member demanding wealth, status, and influence simultaneously, and all while residing outside the jurisdiction of the UK. The demands were presented with precision. Every clause was calculated, as though Meghan had anticipated the objections, the negotiations, and the inevitable resistance. It was a masterclass in strategy: start high, appear reasonable later. For Meghan, this was not just a request, it was a statement, a way to assert her relevance, power, and agency within a system that had long scrutinized and, some would argue, constrained her. The king's advisors were in shock. How could they respond to a demand of this magnitude without risking public outrage, legal complications, and internal dissent? The lawyers debated whether any of her claims had merit. The press office speculated about timing, optics, and potential leaks. The courtiers whispered, trying to measure the impact on the family, the monarchy, and the public perception. Every question seemed to raise more tension. If they acquiesced, would this encourage other royals to make similar demands? If they refused, could Meghan escalate the matter through media channels or legal avenues? At the same time, Meghan's motivations were layered. Some saw her as simply securing what she felt she deserved after years of personal and public challenges. Others speculated that this was a calculated power play, designed to assert control over her narrative and ensure that she remained central in media coverage of the monarchy. And then there were those who considered the children. Her demands implicitly ensured that Archie and Lilibet would retain or regain some measure of royal recognition, securing both financial and symbolic stakes for the next generation. For Meghan, the stakes were deeply personal, profoundly strategic, and unrelentingly ambitious. The palace immediately recognized that ignoring or delaying the response could be disastrous. Communications were drafted, meetings scheduled, and the king consulted with his most trusted advisors. Charles himself was reportedly struck by the audacity of the requests, but understood their seriousness. Every word of Meghan's letter was analyzed, every intention interpreted, every potential public reaction anticipated. In some ways, this was more than a negotiation. It was a challenge, one that demanded careful, decisive, and historically significant action. But what made this situation even more extraordinary was the international attention it drew. Within hours, word of Meghan's intentions leaked to the media. Headlines speculated about royal tension, financial demands, and potential palace conflicts. Social media erupted with debate, memes, and speculation. The public, already divided in opinion about Meghan's role within the royal family, found new reasons to take sides. Some sympathized, seeing a woman trying to assert her rights and protect her children. Others criticized her as demanding and entitled. For Buckingham Palace, this meant that every action taken, or not taken, would be under the microscope of global scrutiny. The demands also forced advisors to confront uncomfortable questions. Could the monarchy realistically meet these requests without setting a dangerous precedent? How could they maintain authority while dealing with a member who wielded both media influence and public sympathy? The stakes were not merely financial or ceremonial. They were about perception, legacy, and the delicate balance of power within the royal family. Meghan's demands, however, were not made impulsively. Every element suggested careful preparation. Legal teams, media consultants, and private advisors likely helped craft the message, ensuring that it was both precise and impactful. In some ways, the demands were a mirror of Meghan herself, controlled, deliberate, and strategically aimed at achieving maximum effect. But in doing so, they also forced the king to respond in kind, quickly, decisively, and publicly enough to maintain authority while minimizing further escalation. What happened next was a series of private meetings that would determine the trajectory of the monarchy. Advisors debated the language of the king's potential response. Courtiers speculated about whether Meghan would accept a compromise or escalate matters further. Every scenario was considered, and every contingency planned. The tension in the palace was palpable, the stakes monumental. For those inside, it felt like a moment in history, a decision that would ripple through the monarchy, the public, and the world stage. But Meghan, living thousands of miles away, remained in control of her narrative. Every public appearance, every interview, every social media post was calculated to assert influence, build pressure, and maintain attention. Her demands were more than a letter. They were the opening move in a high-stakes chess match, and the palace had no choice but to respond strategically. And so, the stage was set. Meghan's demands had forced a confrontation the monarchy could not avoid. The king faced an unprecedented challenge: how to assert authority, uphold tradition, and protect the integrity of the institution, all while navigating global attention, family dynamics, and public opinion. Every moment counted, every decision carried weight, and every action was scrutinized. The news landed like a bombshell. Meghan Markle's demands, her unprecedented requests for reinstatement of royal titles, financial support, and conditions for returning to the United Kingdom, were now officially in the hands of Buckingham Palace. And the reaction was immediate, intense, and, for some, almost visceral. The palace, normally a place of poise, measured statements, and centuries of rigid tradition, erupted behind closed doors with tension, whispers, and urgent deliberations. No one could remember a situation quite like this, where the demands of a single member, living thousands of miles away, forced the entire royal household into a state of high alert. Advisors scrambled. Courtiers whispered in corridors that were usually silent and ordered. Legal teams were pulled into urgent meetings, analyzing every clause, every implied threat, every possible consequence. Every word Meghan had written, every tone in her message, was dissected. Some advisors argued for negotiation, others for an unflinching response. The atmosphere was charged with anxiety and uncertainty. The palace, for all its experience in handling royal crises, faced a new type of challenge. One where media influence, public opinion, and legal strategy collided in an unprecedented storm. The king himself was not insulated from the chaos. Charles, usually measured, thoughtful, and deliberate, now found himself at the center of a storm. Advisors presented scenarios that varied from simple compliance to complete rejection of Meghan's demands, each carrying immense risks. Acquiescing could signal weakness and set a precedent for other royals, potentially destabilizing the careful hierarchy of the monarchy. Rejecting could ignite a media war, alienate supporters, and invite scrutiny of every royal decision. And then there was the added dimension of public perception. How would the world view the monarchy if it appeared to attack a woman who had cultivated a global following? Even within the palace staff, emotions ran high. Some were shocked by the audacity of Meghan's demands. Others were fearful of the consequences, worried that the situation could spiral into a full-blown public relations disaster. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones about the ripple effects this could have on the monarchy, the media frenzy that would inevitably follow, and the delicate balancing act required to maintain both authority and dignity. The tension reached its peak when senior advisors convened in an emergency session. The king, sitting at the head of the long oak table, listened as lawyers, PR experts, and senior courtiers laid out the full implications. They spoke of historical precedent, legal limitations, and potential media fallout. They debated whether any compromise could be reached and what that compromise would look like. Each scenario presented new risks. Every option seemed fraught with danger. The atmosphere was tense, almost electric, as if the walls themselves were aware that a historic decision was about to be made. Some advisors argued for a softer approach, suggesting that dialogue could yield a resolution that preserved the monarchy's dignity while also respecting Meghan's position as the mother of royal children. They pointed out that public sympathy for Meghan could be leveraged, or at least mitigated, with careful messaging. Others, however, warned that any leniency could be interpreted as weakness, emboldening her and potentially creating chaos within the royal family. Their language was stark, precise, and urgent. The reputation of the monarchy, the legacy of the king, and the sanctity of royal protocol were all on the line. Meanwhile, the palace communications team worked tirelessly behind the scenes. They drafted potential statements, prepared for leaks, and anticipated media responses from every major outlet around the world. Social media analysis was conducted to predict public reaction. Even a single misstep in phrasing could ignite a firestorm. Advisors knew that every word released. And then, there was the human element, the personal reactions. King Charles, though disciplined and composed publicly, was navigating a storm of private emotions. He was faced with the delicate task of balancing his role as a father figure, monarch, and public servant. Meghan's demands were not merely professional or strategic, they were personal. They challenged his authority, questioned his judgment, and threatened to undermine the careful equilibrium he had maintained within the royal family. Every advisor recognized that the king's response would be watched not just by the media, but by generations of royal historians and the global public. The courtiers themselves felt the pressure. They had spent years maintaining the illusion of order and tradition, but now they were thrust into a situation of uncertainty and risk. Whispered conversations filled the corridors of Buckingham Palace late into the night. Questions were asked quietly. Could the king refuse without causing a public scandal? Could Meghan escalate matters through her media allies? Would the children become pawns in a battle they could not comprehend? The weight of these questions was suffocating, and the palace felt like it was on the edge of a precipice. Outside, the press began to catch wind of unrest. Rumors swirled. Analysts speculated, often inaccurately, about the nature of Meghan's demands and the possible responses of the monarchy. Public opinion polls began to fluctuate wildly, with some segments of the population expressing support for Meghan and others defending the king. The palace understood that the optics of every decision were critical. The world was watching, ready to judge, criticize, and dissect every move. But the most pressing concern was time. Meghan's demands were not a vague proposal. They came with a clear timeline and expectation for resolution. The palace had to act swiftly to assert control, maintain authority, and manage the narrative. Delay could be disastrous, giving Meghan's team opportunities to shape public perception and pressure the monarchy further. Every hour counted, and every misstep could have consequences far beyond the palace walls. Then came the quiet moments of reflection in the king's private chambers. Charles, understanding the magnitude of the situation, began to weigh every option. Advisors were summoned in a series of confidential consultations. Each strategy was debated: negotiation, refusal, partial compromise, or decisive action. The historical implications were considered, the potential media fallout assessed, and the personal dimensions weighed. In those moments, the king's resolve began to solidify. He understood that his response would define his reign, set precedent for future generations, and potentially alter the very structure of the monarchy. But the palace also knew that whatever decision was made, Meghan's reaction would be immediate and possibly explosive. Legal teams were placed on standby. PR strategies were drafted for multiple scenarios. Courtiers whispered about possible international ramifications, alliances she might form, and the ways in which the public could be mobilized. It was a chess game on a scale the palace had never experienced, and every move mattered. And so, as Buckingham Palace braced for the confrontation to come, the tension reached its peak. Meghan's demands had triggered a crisis unlike any in recent royal history, forcing the monarchy into rapid, decisive, and high-stakes action. Advisors, courtiers, and the king himself understood that this was no ordinary negotiation. This was a battle for authority, legacy, and the very essence of what it meant to be a member of the British royal family. Every whisper in the halls, every consultation behind closed doors, Every tense glance exchanged among advisors was building toward a moment of historic consequence. The palace was on edge, the world was watching, and one question loomed over everyone. How would King Charles respond? In the quiet, imposing chambers of Buckingham Palace, a storm was brewing. But unlike the chaos unfolding in the corridors, this was a storm contained within the mind and heart of one man, King Charles III. The palace, known for its centuries of tradition, for carefully measured statements and disciplined decorum, suddenly felt smaller, almost suffocating. Every inch of the gilded room seemed to echo with anticipation, as if the walls themselves understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. This was not just another royal decision. This was a defining moment, a choice that would reverberate through the monarchy, the media, and history itself. The private meeting was called with urgency. Only the most trusted advisors were permitted entry, their presence a delicate balance of counsel and loyalty. Lawyers, courtiers, and senior aides assembled quietly, the weight of centuries of royal precedent hanging over their heads. Charles himself, though composed, was internally grappling with the enormity of Meghan Markle's demands. Reinstatement of titles, financial demands, and conditional return, all intricately intertwined with the futures of Archie and Lilibet, had left him with a choice that was as perilous as it was unprecedented. He had learned long ago that leadership in the monarchy was a delicate dance between authority and compassion. Decisions could not be made impulsively. The consequences were measured not just in immediate outcomes, but in generational legacy. And now, every advisor in the room knew the stakes. A misstep could destabilize public perception, inflame media narratives, and strain the royal family in ways that would be impossible to repair. The tension was nearly tangible. One could almost hear the clock ticking in the room, each second a reminder that the decision could not wait. Charles began the meeting by reviewing Meghan's demands in detail. Lawyers outlined every clause, every implied obligation, every precedent, or lack thereof. Advisors discussed historical analogies, comparing the situation to past disputes involving estranged royals, divorces, and contested claims. Yet nothing in history truly mirrored the audacity and global implications of Meghan's requests. For the king, this was uncharted territory. Every word she had written, every carefully measured tone, had been designed to elicit a response, to challenge authority, and to test the boundaries of royal protocol. The discussion quickly turned to strategy. Some advisors urged caution, arguing that a negotiation could allow a resolution that maintained dignity while avoiding a public spectacle. Others warned that any compromise could be seen as weakness, a dangerous precedent that might encourage future challenges. Legal experts analyzed potential lawsuits, media experts predicted public reaction, and courtiers debated the optics of every possible action. It was a rare moment in the palace. Absolute focus, all energies directed at a single, monumental question. Charles listened, absorbing every argument, weighing every possibility. He thought about his legacy, about the monarchy, and about the example he set for his children and grandchildren. But he also considered the human element, Meghan as a mother, a former family member, and a global figure capable of mobilizing public opinion in her favor. Every option had risk. Every option had consequences. And in that room, the pressure was suffocating. The king's advisors presented potential outcomes in painstaking detail. If they agreed to some of Meghan's demands, titles could be reinstated, but at the cost of perceived authority. If they refused, the media backlash could be severe, and she might leverage her platform to shape public opinion. Legal battles could ensue, and every action would be scrutinized globally. Charles weighed the ethical implications as well. Archie and Lilibet's place in the monarchy, Meghan's well-being, and the reputation of the royal institution. Each factor demanded consideration, and each could not be ignored. As the meeting progressed, the tension became almost unbearable. Advisors spoke rapidly, sometimes interrupting each other, as ideas collided. Some recommended a carefully worded compromise, a strategic message designed to appease public opinion while maintaining control. Others suggested a firm stance, arguing that authority could not be compromised, that the monarchy's integrity must come first. Lawyers advised caution, detailing every precedent that might support or undermine a decision. The room felt electric, the weight of history pressing down on every word spoken. At one point, Charles paused, looking around the room. The advisors fell silent. In that moment, the king's mind was working faster than anyone could follow, processing centuries of tradition, decades of personal experience, and the immediate crisis before him. He understood that this was more than a negotiation. It was a test of his resolve, a challenge to his authority, and a moment that would define his reign. He knew that any misstep could be catastrophic. Every option had implications far beyond what the advisors could predict. Then came the pivotal question: how to act decisively while minimizing damage. The king realized that delay, even a single day, could allow Meghan to shape public opinion and gain leverage. Waiting was dangerous. Hesitation could signal weakness. And so, he began to chart a path, firm, measured, and historic. The advisors watched as Charles's calm exterior concealed the storm of calculations and deliberations occurring within. They knew they were witnessing history in real time. The discussion turned to timing. How should the palace release the decision? Should it be a private notice first, or a public statement? How would the media react? How would Meghan respond? Every potential reaction was mapped, analyzed, and debated. The legal and PR teams argued over wording, phrasing, and implications. Courtiers discussed the emotional fallout, considering both the royal family and the global audience. Charles listened, processing everything, until a decision crystallized in his mind. He would act decisively. Not with hesitation, not with compromise, but with a clear, unambiguous declaration. The king understood that the monarchy could not be seen as negotiable, that tradition and protocol could not be compromised, and that authority had to be asserted, firmly, decisively, and irrevocably. The decision was as much about principle as it was about strategy. The monarchy could survive crises, scandals, and challenges, but only if it maintained its dignity and its rules. And then, after hours of consultation, discussion, and debate, the king made the choice. It was not rash. It was not impulsive. It was deliberate, calculated, and historic. The emergency order would be issued, a decree stripping Meghan Markle of all royal titles, privileges, and conditional claims. The decision was made not out of malice, but out of necessity. It was a statement of authority, a safeguard for the institution, and a message to anyone who might think that tradition could be bent or bought. As the advisors absorbed the weight of this decision, the room fell silent. The gravity of the moment was almost unbearable. The king had acted, and the next steps would unfold rapidly. Letters would be drafted, communications prepared, and the public would soon learn of the unprecedented action. But even in that silence, one thought lingered. How would Meghan react? How would the world respond? And what would be the immediate consequences for the monarchy, for the family, and for history itself? The private meeting concluded, but the storm was far from over. The king's decision, though firm, was only the beginning. The palace braced for the next wave, public scrutiny, media frenzy, and Meghan's inevitable response. Every advisor, every lawyer, every aide understood that the situation would escalate, and that the global spotlight was about to turn relentlessly toward Buckingham Palace. And so, with a single decision, the stage was set. King Charles had chosen decisively, but the world had yet to see the full consequences. The next moments would test the monarchy, challenge public perception, and force Meghan to respond in ways no one could predict. History was in motion, and the outcome was far from certain. In the hushed, candlelit corridors of Buckingham Palace, history was being written. The emergency order, carefully drafted and meticulously reviewed, represented a seismic moment for the British monarchy. Never before had a living member of the royal family, a former senior royal no less, faced the complete stripping of titles and privileges in such a swift, decisive manner. The weight of centuries of tradition pressed down on every line of the document, and the implications were both immediate and far-reaching. This was not just a legal decree. It was a statement, a warning, and a declaration of authority, all rolled into one. The emergency order was born from weeks of tension, negotiation, and behind-the-scenes deliberation. Meghan Markle's demands had tested the limits of the monarchy, challenging the balance between personal rights and institutional authority. Advisors, courtiers, and legal teams had debated endlessly over phrasing, consequences, and optics. They scrutinized historical precedents, consulted constitutional scholars, and even considered the international perception of the monarchy. Every word mattered, every clause carried weight, and every decision was scrutinized under the lens of centuries-old tradition. King Charles III, after exhaustive consultations, signed the order personally. The act was both symbolic and practical. Symbolic, because it asserted the authority of the sovereign, demonstrating that no member of the royal family, regardless of public influence or media power, was above the rules. Practical, because it created a legal and ceremonial framework for enforcing Meghan's removal from all titles and privileges. In effect, the order was a definitive response. Negotiations were over, boundaries were clear, and the monarchy's authority was unambiguous. The emergency order did not simply revoke Meghan's titles. It also addressed financial arrangements, ceremonial responsibilities, and public representation. It explicitly stated that any claims to official duties or roles within the royal family were null and void. Moreover, the document laid out a framework for enforcement, making clear that the monarchy would not tolerate attempts to circumvent the decree, either legally or through public relations maneuvers. For the palace, this was essential. It was not enough to revoke privileges. The action needed to be perceived as final, irrevocable, and backed by authority. For those working behind the scenes, the drafting of the order was a monumental task. Lawyers pored over centuries of precedent, carefully balancing the need for firmness with the necessity of accuracy. Courtiers and advisors debated every nuance, considering not only legal language but also ceremonial phrasing. The words chosen were deliberate, precise, and unyielding. They conveyed authority without malice, firmness without vindictiveness, and clarity without ambiguity. Every detail mattered, because any misstep could be exploited by media channels, legal teams, or Meghan herself. The reaction inside the palace, once the order was signed, was electric. Senior advisors felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that the decision had been made, that the monarchy had asserted its authority, and that a framework for enforcement was now in place. Apprehension because they knew the world would scrutinize every detail, every implication, every potential loophole. This was not just a royal decision. It was a global event, with consequences reaching far beyond the palace walls. Meanwhile, Meghan's camp was watching, analyzing, and preparing. Word of the emergency order leaked quickly, as leaks often do in high-profile royal matters. The media pounced. Headlines blared across newspapers, television screens, and social media feeds. Meghan stripped of all titles. No negotiations left. Historic royal decree issued. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Supporters of Meghan expressed outrage, framing the order as heavy-handed or punitive. Critics applauded the king's decisiveness, praising the move as necessary to uphold tradition. For Buckingham Palace, this was exactly as anticipated, a polarizing event that forced the world to pay attention while reinforcing the monarchy's authority. The emergency order also created an internal ripple effect within the royal family. Members watched closely, understanding that the decree was not only about Meghan but about precedent. How would this affect future negotiations, disputes, and internal challenges? How would the family navigate public appearances, ceremonial duties, and media scrutiny now that one of their own had been publicly stripped of all privileges? Every decision now carried amplified weight. Every gesture was scrutinized, and every statement had potential consequences. From a ceremonial perspective, the emergency order had immediate implications. Meghan could no longer be referred to by her royal titles in any official capacity. Invitations to royal events were rescinded. Any association with formal duties or representation of the monarchy was strictly prohibited. Even subtle public references, photographs, official statements, or mentions in ceremonial programs had to adhere to the new decree. For the king, these measures were essential to reinforce authority and prevent ambiguity. For Meghan, they represented a profound personal and symbolic loss, one that would resonate in public perception as well as private reality. The drafting and execution of the emergency order also reflected the unique pressures of modern monarchy. In centuries past, similar disputes may have remained private, managed entirely behind closed doors. Today, the global media, instant communication, and social networks ensured that every detail would be public within hours. Advisors had to consider not only legal language and protocol, but also narrative management. Every word had to be defensible, every line carefully chosen to minimize potential backlash while maximizing clarity and authority. The king's decision was as much about optics as it was about legality. Even as the emergency orders circulated internally, the palace prepared for Meghan's inevitable response. Legal teams reviewed potential strategies for contesting the order, while PR advisors prepared messaging for the public. The monarchy understood that, despite the order's decisiveness, Meghan could still shape the narrative to her advantage. Every press release, statement, or media appearance was carefully planned, with contingencies for multiple scenarios. The palace was locked in a tense, high-stakes battle of authority, influence, and perception. The emotional weight of the moment was not lost on King Charles. While the order represented a firm assertion of authority, it also carried deeply personal consequences. Meghan was not simply a public figure. She was once a member of the family, the mother of his grandchildren, and a woman with influence over 2 young lives. The king had to balance institutional integrity with compassion, personal loyalty with duty, and public perception with private reality. Every aspect of the order reflected this tension: firmness tempered with prudence, clarity balanced with subtlety, authority reinforced with dignity. And yet, despite all preparation, despite meticulous drafting and exhaustive consultation, the palace knew the emergency order was only the beginning. Its issuance would trigger a cascade of events: legal maneuvers, media campaigns, public debates, and personal reactions that could not be fully predicted. The emergency order was more than a document. It was a declaration. It was a statement of principle. It was a historic act that demonstrated that, even in an era of unprecedented scrutiny and modern challenges, the monarchy retained its authority and its ability to act decisively. The world watched, fascinated, divided, and waiting. And at that moment, the stage was set for the next act of a drama that would continue to unfold on both sides of the Atlantic, with consequences far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. Across the Atlantic, in her California residence, Meghan Markle's day began like any other, or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. Advisors were moving behind the scenes, emails pinged quietly, and her team monitored every hint of movement from the palace. Meghan had prepared for negotiations, carefully plotting her return to the UK on her terms. She had assumed leverage, control, and the ability to shape outcomes to her favor. But nothing could have prepared her for what would arrive next: the emergency order from King Charles himself, stripping her of all titles, privileges, and royal connections. The news reached her through a combination of confidential palace communications and, inevitably, media leaks. The initial reaction was disbelief. Meghan stared at the documents in shock, her mind racing to comprehend the implications. Every title she had once held, every privilege associated with her royal status, had been revoked in a single, decisive stroke. It was a move unprecedented in modern monarchy, a clear, unambiguous message: no more negotiations. The audacity of the king's action was matched only by the weight of its consequences. Meghan's advisors immediately convened. Lawyers, media strategists, and personal aides gathered in her home, analyzing the order, debating options, and preparing responses. Some argued for legal action, suggesting that the emergency order could be challenged in courts or through international channels. Others urged caution, warning that public confrontation could backfire, further tarnishing her image and weakening her leverage. The atmosphere was tense, urgent, and fraught with anxiety. Meghan, however, remained composed outwardly, though internally, the shock was undeniable. The revocation of titles was more than symbolic. It altered her identity, her role, and her connection to the monarchy irrevocably. Every official engagement, every ceremonial responsibility, every public affiliation was now off limits. Invitations to royal events were canceled, and references in official documents were amended to reflect her new status. For Meghan, this was a profound personal blow. A reminder of the delicate balance between personal ambition and institutional authority. Titles and privileges were not merely ceremonial. They were a reflection of status, influence, and recognition within a global institution. Their removal was both humiliating and strategically devastating. The financial implications were equally significant. Meghan's requests for thousands of dollars in support were now rendered moot. Any claim she had for funding tied to royal status had been explicitly denied. The king's order made it clear privileges and finances associated with her former royal role would no longer be available under any circumstances. For Meghan, this was a stark reminder of the power imbalance she faced. Despite her influence, media presence, and strategic planning, the monarchy had asserted itself decisively. Even more critical was the impact on her children, Archie and Lilibet. Meghan's demands had tied their status to her return and her reinstatement. The emergency order, by extension, also affected their potential claims to ceremonial recognition, public representation, and royal privileges. This raised profound questions about inheritance, succession, and the future of the children within the royal framework. Meghan's advisors debated how to frame this internally, understanding that public attention on the children could be intense and emotionally charged. The media, as expected, reacted almost instantly. Headlines blared worldwide. Meghan stripped of titles, royal decree issued, no negotiations left. Social media erupted, with users debating, criticizing, and supporting every aspect of the unfolding drama. Analysts speculated on the implications for the monarchy, Meghan's reputation, and the global perception of royal authority. In California, Meghan watched the news cycle with intensity, aware that public narrative could influence outcomes as much as legal or ceremonial actions. Every headline, every tweet, every opinion piece mattered, and her team worked tirelessly to monitor, analyze, and respond. Meghan's emotional response was complex. Publicly composed, she had to maintain her image of control and confidence. Privately, the news struck deeply. The emergency order represented a rejection, not just of her demands, but of her agency within the royal family. It was a reminder that, no matter her global influence or media presence, the king had ultimate authority over the monarchy. For Meghan, this was not simply a procedural setback. It was a personal and symbolic confrontation that would shape her narrative for years to come. Legal discussions quickly became heated. Advisors debated whether the emergency order could be challenged, whether international law could offer recourse, and how public opinion could be leveraged. Some suggested a strategic media campaign to rally support and pressure the monarchy indirectly. Others cautioned that any aggressive approach could backfire, painting Meghan as combative or entitled. The stakes were immense. Her personal ambitions, her family status, and her public image were all at risk. Every decision needed precision, timing, and careful calculation. Meghan also began to consider the broader implications. Beyond her own titles and privileges, the order set a precedent. The monarchy could and would act decisively to assert authority, even against a high-profile, internationally recognized figure. This had consequences for her influence, her ability to negotiate future engagements, and her role in shaping media narratives. The emergency order was not just a personal affront. It was a structural challenge to the way she had interacted with the royal institution. Emotionally, the realization was staggering. Meghan understood that her next moves would define her legacy, her public perception, and the future of her children within the royal narrative. She was no longer a returning royal seeking reconciliation. She was now a former royal, publicly rebuffed and stripped of privileges, facing global scrutiny. Every decision from this point forward carried extraordinary risk and reward, with consequences far beyond what any individual could control. As Meghan processed the news, her team worked tirelessly to prepare options. They reviewed legal frameworks, analyzed media strategy, and considered every potential response, measured, aggressive, public, and private. Meghan herself had to weigh the emotional and strategic costs. How to respond without inflaming public opinion, how to protect her children, and how to maintain her own agency in a situation where authority had clearly shifted. The day wore on, the tension unrelenting. Emails, calls, and messages flooded in from advisors, allies, and legal teams. Media outlets continued to speculate, and social media amplified every nuance of the unfolding drama. Meghan realized that this was more than a personal challenge. It was a public spectacle, a global event, and a pivotal moment in the history of the monarchy. Her reaction, carefully calibrated, would be scrutinized, dissected, and debated around the world. By evening, the initial shock had begun to transform into determination. Meghan, accustomed to media battles, global attention, and high-stakes negotiations, understood that the emergency order was both a challenge and an opportunity. It tested her resolve, her strategy, and her ability to navigate a system that had, for centuries, operated on rules she now found herself outside of. How she chose to respond next would not only shape her personal narrative, but could influence public opinion, media portrayal, and the broader perception of the monarchy itself. But even as Meghan gathered her thoughts and prepared her next move, one thing was certain. The emergency order had changed the game entirely. It had forced a confrontation the world was watching closely, tested the boundaries of power and influence, and set the stage for a dramatic escalation. The monarchy had acted decisively, and Meghan, now stripped of all titles and privileges, faced a reality far different from the one she had envisioned. As the shock of the emergency order settled in, Meghan Markle's legal team sprang into action. Across multiple offices in California, London, and even New York, her attorneys convened, drafting strategies, analyzing loopholes, and coordinating with media advisors. This was no ordinary legal challenge. It was a high-stakes confrontation between a former senior royal and the reigning monarch, with the world watching every move. Every email, call, and confidential briefing carried urgency. Every detail mattered. From the start, Meghan's team knew that time was critical. Any delay could cement the king's action as irreversible, solidifying public perception that she had been decisively shut out of royal life. They studied the emergency order line by line, seeking any ambiguity that could be leveraged. Legal analysts debated its enforceability, its jurisdictional limits, and the potential for international intervention. After all, Meghan resided in the United States, where she had access to a different set of legal protections. Could the monarchy's decree hold across borders? Could it be challenged in court, or at least delayed? These questions dominated their early discussions. The team's first priority was to establish a narrative, both legal and public, that framed Meghan not as a defiant or entitled figure, but as someone exercising her rights. They recognized that public opinion could influence legal proceedings indirectly, especially in high-profile international cases. Media advisors began drafting statements emphasizing her role as a mother, her global influence, and her desire for fair treatment. The messaging was carefully calibrated, assertive without aggressive, dignified without submissive. The goal was to create a sympathetic public perception that could counterbalance the palace's official authority. Legal strategy quickly became multi-pronged. First, they evaluated potential challenges within the UK legal framework. Could the emergency order, issued by the king, be contested in any court? Were there procedural errors, technical oversights, or historical precedents that could be cited? While the monarchy operates with a unique blend of tradition and authority, the team searched meticulously for any leverage, understanding that even a small advantage could create room for negotiation or delay. Second, the international angle was examined. Meghan, as a dual citizen with global media influence, could potentially invoke international human rights or contractual arguments. Her team explored whether there were avenues to contest the order beyond the UK's jurisdiction, particularly if aspects of the decree impacted her freedom of movement, financial rights, or parental authority. They understood that even raising these possibilities could complicate the monarchy's position, forcing them to defend decisions on multiple fronts simultaneously. While the legal team worked tirelessly, the palace watched closely. Every action Meghan's advisors took was analyzed, every public statement monitored, and every potential court filing anticipated. The emergency order had set the stage, but the next move belonged to Meghan. Her legal team's strategy was designed not only to protect her interests, but to signal that she would not be easily sidelined. For Buckingham Palace, this presented a delicate challenge. Respond too aggressively, and they risked a global backlash. Appear passive, and the order's authority could be undermined. Meanwhile, Meghan herself began coordinating directly with her team. She studied potential approaches, weighed risks, and considered public messaging. Every word she spoke to her legal advisors was measured. She knew that this was no ordinary negotiation. This was a battle with both legal and symbolic dimensions, a confrontation with implications for her legacy, her children, and her global image. Meghan's focus was unwavering, her determination clear. She would not be sidelined quietly, and every avenue of influence and leverage had to be explored. The team's first move was tactical. They issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging the emergency order while signaling intent to challenge aspects of it. The statement did not directly confront the king, but instead emphasized her role as a mother, her global commitments, and her desire for fair treatment. It was a nuanced approach, designed to maintain public sympathy while laying the groundwork for legal maneuvering. Analysts immediately predicted that the statement would dominate headlines, and within hours, media coverage began framing Meghan as a proactive and determined figure facing unprecedented royal authority. In parallel, the legal team prepared confidential filings, exploring avenues to challenge the order in court. They examined potential technicalities, including procedural oversight, interpretation of royal prerogatives, and jurisdictional reach. Each argument was carefully crafted to maximize impact without provoking unnecessary retaliation. This was a delicate balancing act, assertive enough to preserve her position, cautious enough to avoid escalation that could be detrimental in the court of public opinion. The palace, for its part, responded internally with heightened alert. Advisors reviewed Meghan's actions in real time, assessing potential vulnerabilities, media risks, and legal implications. Courtiers debated whether to issue clarifying statements, maintain silence, or counter the narrative proactively. Legal experts analyzed possible scenarios, preparing contingency plans to uphold the emergency order in the face of any challenge. The tension inside Buckingham Palace was palpable. Meghan's team had effectively turned a private royal decision into a global, high-stakes confrontation. As the legal strategy unfolded, Meghan also began planning the next stage, media influence. Her team coordinated interviews, social media posts, and op-eds, all designed to reinforce her narrative. Messaging emphasized fairness, family, and global responsibility, subtly framing the emergency order as an overreach while highlighting her commitment to her children. The goal was to control the narrative as much as possible, turning public attention into leverage for potential negotiation or legal recourse. The stakes were immense. Every action, every word, every public appearance carried potential consequences. Meghan's legal team understood that a single misstep could undermine years of carefully built influence. Yet they were determined, methodical, and relentless. They operated with the understanding that the emergency order had fundamentally shifted power dynamics, and that the next moves, strategic, legal, and public, would determine how far Meghan could regain influence, protect her interests, and assert her voice against an institution thousands of years old. By the end of the day, the legal team had laid out multiple contingency plans. They were prepared for court filings, public statements, international media coverage, and potential negotiation attempts. Meghan herself had reviewed every option, weighing personal, strategic, and familial considerations. One thing was certain. The emergency order had set a confrontation in motion, and Meghan was not planning to be a passive participant. The palace, aware of the intensity and sophistication of her response, braced for the next escalation. Advisors understood that Meghan's legal and media strategies could influence not only public perception, but also the practical enforcement of the emergency order. The delicate balance of authority, tradition, and public opinion was now being tested on an unprecedented scale. And yet, even as Meghan's team mobilized, the king's decision remained resolute. Charles had acted decisively, asserting authority in a manner designed to be unambiguous and final. The tension between the monarchy's power and Meghan's global influence was now fully exposed, creating a high-stakes standoff with no clear resolution in sight. As Meghan Markle's legal team mobilized, the the palace braced for an inevitable consequence: the media storm. Within hours of the emergency order becoming known, headlines erupted across newspapers, television broadcasts, and social media feeds around the globe. The story of a former senior royal stripped of all titles, privileges, and claims to royal authority captured public attention like few events in modern history. Every outlet scrambled to interpret the implications, predict the fallout, and speculate on what would happen next. The sheer scale of the coverage was unprecedented. Major news networks interrupted regular programming to cover the story. Social media exploded with hashtags trending worldwide, including hashtag Meghan stripped, hashtag royal decree, and hashtag Buckingham shock. Opinion pieces flooded online platforms, framing the events in a range of perspectives, some sympathetic to Meghan, others praising King Charles's decisiveness. Every tweet, every post, every headline became a battleground of interpretation, a microcosm of the tension unfolding between personal ambition and institutional authority. The palace's media team was immediately on high alert. Advisors analyzed coverage minute by minute, prepared statements to clarify the monarchy's position, and monitored global sentiment. Every word in press releases, every photograph, and every official statement was scrutinized to ensure it aligned with the king's decision and reinforced the authority of the monarchy. The palace understood that in the age of instantaneous communication, perception was as critical as legal or ceremonial authority. Missteps could be amplified, distortions could spread, and public opinion could tilt against them in ways that were unpredictable and uncontrollable. Meanwhile, Meghan's team worked to seize control of the narrative. Carefully timed statements highlighted her role as a mother, her global influence, and her desire for fairness. Media appearances were planned strategically, interviews conducted with select journalists, and social media posts crafted to evoke empathy while subtly framing the emergency order as heavy-handed. Every move was designed to maintain public sympathy, assert her voice, and challenge the perception that she had been completely sidelined. International attention intensified the stakes. In the United States, major news networks dissected every aspect of the situation, analyzing the legal and symbolic implications of the emergency order. Analysts debated whether the monarchy had overstepped its authority or acted appropriately to preserve centuries of tradition. In the United Kingdom, tabloids and broadsheets offered contrasting narratives, some framing Meghan as a victim of royal rigidity, others as a figure attempting to leverage global attention against a sovereign institution. The public